Hello, I'm Michael Giuliani, and this is Straight Talk. With me today is Professor Tang Hei-Wai. You're from the University of Hong Kong. You're an economist, economics professor. Now, the world is in a mess with this global coronavirus pandemic. Many people say when the world eventually comes out of it, there is going to be a new normal for the whole world. Is there going to be a new normal?
I believe there will be a new normal. We are in the biggest global recession since the Great Depression in the 30s. The recession right now is much bigger than what has happened in 2008, 2009 during the global financial crisis. We are talking about global lockdowns. To say that is a recession is already an undersell. You see draconian measures being practiced to restrict travels, to restrict businesses, to practice social distancing in the US and also in emerging economies. So we are going to see substantial reshuffling of resources. We are going to see big businesses going to expand. We're going to see small business going to leave the market. And the reason is, when you look at the market right now, those that are cash rich, those that are capitalized will be able to survive. And conditional on survival, they are going to thrive because they're going to see less competition due to exit of small, medium enterprises. This is going to be true in Hong Kong, in the US, and also in China.
You say there's going to be a global recession. That recession is underway now, right?
It is happening, and the worst has yet to come. And this is true for China.
Tell me how bad the worst is going to be.
If you look at the recent forecasts by the International Monetary Fund, the forecast for global GDP is going to be a negative 3% growth in 2020. For the US, it's going to be a negative 5%. For China, it's going to be positive 1.2%. China is one of the few countries that will still have a positive growth. But remember, 1.2% is a very low number for China, and China still had a benchmark of 6% GDP growth before the coronavirus.
But US President Donald Trump says when this pandemic is over, he thinks the American economy will bounce back very quickly.
Yeah, when it is over. The question is when it is going to be over. And the interesting thing is that just about 2 months ago, when the coronavirus happened in China, I and several economists predicted that there will be a V-shaped recovery in China, but also in the rest of the world.
A V-shape, but that's not going to happen.
That is not going to happen. It's going to be a U-shape. And Lawrence Summers today just said it may be a W-shape in the sense that there will be a recovery, but there would be second or third wave of infections that will push the global economy back again.
So you're saying the new normal is going to be big companies will survive, small companies won't survive. So we're going to see a new normal where there's going to be less competition. If there's going to be less competition, it's bad for consumers, isn't that right?
I think it's going to be bad for consumers. Just give you two examples. One example is the airline industry. Just in the last few days, we already heard of news about merger and acquisitions due to obviously the
That's going to drive up airfares if there's going to be less competition.
Drive up airfares. It's going to be bad for us who travel. And those acquisitions are going to be supported by government that are cash rich. So it is going to be...
So the poorer countries are going to suffer a lot more.
The poor countries are going to suffer more. The poor people are going to suffer more. The poor businesses, meaning small and medium enterprises, are going to have less leverage to deal with the recession compared to the big
Professor,
ones.
There is a lot of friction now between the US and China over the coronavirus issue because Donald Trump's been saying almost daily, and the UK government has said, and the Australian government has said there's going to be an accountability of what happened, why it happened, could it had not been stopped earlier. All that has led to talk of a decoupling between the US and probably with the Western countries with China. China is now the world's so-called factory producing a lot of stuff. A lot of things are produced there for export. Just yesterday, a couple of days ago, the American president says, we're going to pull those factories out of China. We're going to have to make those factories work in US instead. That is going to be a decoupling of the world's two largest economies, right? Do you see that happening?
Michael, just to be clear, the decoupling has happened already in March 2018 when the US and China started a trade war. And the trade war is still going on. It has lasted for more than 2 years already. So when people ask me about whether the coronavirus is going to make the world more decoupled, my answer to them is probably yes, But the trend of decoupling has been going on for a while, and in the next few years, we're not going to see improvement in the relationship between the superpowers. So the short answer is yes, coronavirus is not going to help. It is not going to change the direction of decoupling. We have seen deglobalization for a while already.
So there is deglobalization going on now.
It has been going on for
Is that
for a
good
while.
or bad for the world?
It's bad for the world in the sense that trade, so I'm a trade economist, I always argue that international trade is good in the sense that it will increase efficiency, it will increase real GDP for countries that participated in global value chains. So when you see less globalization, you're going to see less economic growth and also less productivity growth. So don't get me wrong, during the long period of globalization, there are winners and losers.
Who's going to win, who's going to lose?
So in the last 30, 40 years, the winners are obviously multinational firms, people who are in occupations that benefit from globalization, such as finance, such as international trade. In the deglobalization period, we would expect that those multinational firms are going to suffer more. Emerging markets will also suffer more if there's less foreign direct investment, which has been shown by research that can increase productivity in those countries.
Well, China had benefited a lot from globalization and joining the World Trade Organization, right? If there's going to be deglobalization, decoupling, how does that affect China?
China is going to grow slower, for sure. You made a very good point, and I was going to follow up with that background. When China joined the WTO in 2001, between 2000 and 2008, China had experienced the fastest possible growth for China and also for the rest of the world, right? We have never seen such a explosive growth in any emerging market, period, right? Not to mention the biggest developing country at that time. So China benefited a lot from globalization that was accompanied with privatization, right? So those two things sort of reinforce with each other for 8 or 9 years. The rest is history, right? So since the global financial crisis in 2008, we have started to see deglobalization, partially driven by the slowdown of the extension of global value chains, partially driven by populism, protectionism that we see around the world. So China has been slowing down, right? So I don't have to mention that they used to have a 2-digit percent GDP growth rate. Now we are talking about 1.2% according to the IMF forecast.
How does that affect Hong Kong? Because we're very dependent on the U.S., and we're also very dependent on mainland China, right? So if there is decoupling, if there is deglobalization, we get affected a lot by external factors, right? So can we survive?
Well, Hong Kong will always survive.
I know, but in what form?
The question is how much Hong Kong or Hong Kong economy will suffer.
How much do you think it will?
I think...
when there's decoupling and deglobalization between the world's two economic superpowers, how will Hong Kong suffer?
So when people talk about U.S.-China trade war, they tend to focus on China and the U.S.
Right.
And say, these two countries are going to suffer the most. But the truth is, these two largest economies in the world are actually less dependent on trade and foreign direct investment compared to a lot of the small open economies like Hong Kong or Singapore. So given the nature of Hong Kong and Singapore, these economies are going to be more dependent on external macro fluctuations. So my conjecture is, we're going to experience a lot of volatility
in Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong economy, which is going to spill over to politics and other things.
If there's going to be volatility, in the past few days, we've had this political issue, and that led to a lot of the Western countries saying that mainland China is interfering in Hong Kong's domestic affairs, right? With this argument about whether the liaison office has a right to say things or interfere in Hong Kong's affairs. You have the mass arrest of some democracy leaders. Is that also going to worsen Hong Kong's situation and further the decoupling and perhaps even lead to the U.S. declaring that Hong Kong no longer lives up to the Hong Kong Policy Act and therefore withdraw that act, and then Hong Kong is going to suffer even more, right?
So the Hong Kong economy has grown based on very strong institutional fundamentals, right? The rule of law, the relatively independent legal and judicial systems.
The West is seeing that it's eroding, the freedoms are eroding.
So that's my
point,
right?
Us?
When you think about finance, as an example, investors prefer to set up their headquarters or invest in Hong Kong rather than in a major Chinese city, partly because obviously of the experience of the Hong Kong economy, partly because of the talents here. But a large part is related to basically the relatively more mature, more stable legal and financial market, legal system and financial markets. So, when the perceptions about A, the financial status of Hong Kong is declining, and B, the legal system is not as good as before.
And C, the mainland is interfering in Hong Kong's domestic affairs.
Yeah, perhaps. So those perceptions are going to affect essentially investors and businesses' long-term strategies in Hong Kong.
Okay, before the break, just one more question on this issue. There is a Hong Kong Policy Act, right? Special trade status for Hong Kong, right, given by the U.S. If this so-called, if the perception is that there is a lot of interference, they withdraw that act, Hong Kong no longer has a special status. How does that affect us?
So re-export is a big part of Hong Kong's export. If the U.S. government started to put tariffs on Hong Kong's export, like what they did on China, it's going to affect export substantially. And when we think about trade, it's a two-way game, right? Like you have export, you have import, and then along with that, you have foreign direct investment. So all of them are going to be significantly affected. Obviously, the counterfactual has never happened before, so I don't have a specific number to tell you, but the impact is going to be substantial.
All right, quick break. See you soon. Don't go away. Thanks for staying with us. This is Straight Talk with me, Professor Tang Hei. He's from the University of Hong Kong. He's an economist. Professor Tang, now you said before the break that on top of this pandemic issue, which is affecting the world, Hong Kong itself has got now this new political issue of whether the mainland China is interfering in Hong Kong's domestic affairs. And, Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued a strong statement. The UK government issued a strong statement. International Bar Association issued a strong statement against this. Now, when this thing is seen in this context of interference, and then you've also got, before this thing happened, you've got the UK government, you've got the Australian government, you've got the US government saying because of the coronavirus and the way they see it, and perhaps they felt that maybe China did not announce the outbreak soon enough, and that affected a lot of people, that it's not going to be business as normal with China. Now, when Western leaders say it's not going to be business as normal with China, what do they mean? How do you interpret what they say?
So when you look at the recent policies coming out from Japan, the Japanese government decided to spend $20 billion to encourage Japanese firms
to move back to Japan, right?
Yeah, to Japan or to the rest of the world, but not China. And then immediately you have heard Larry Kudlow, who is the head of National Economic Council in the U.S., saying, well, this is a good idea. Maybe the U.S. government should also implement this.
Is that practical, though, Professor? Because labor is a lot less expensive in China than it is in the U.S. If you move these factories back to the U.S., goods are going to cost a lot more.
Exactly. So I think what would happen is there will be a lot of reorganization of supply chains on the lower end of manufacturing, right? And we have seen that happening in the last 2 years since the trade war. There's a paper by a researcher in the United Nations, and he has found that since the beginning of the trade war to now, there has been substantial trade diversion. What it means is that you see 25% decline of Chinese exports to the U.S., but the U.S. is not going to import less from the rest of the world. In fact, there's a lot of increase in exports from Vietnam, Mexico, and even some of the European Union countries to the U.S. So does that mean that the substitution is perfect? No, because as a whole, U.S. is still losing some of the imports from the rest of the world. So trade diversion is not going to be complete, and we have already seen, based on research, increases in consumer prices in the U.S.
If the factories move out of China, right? Japan, as you said, has put in a lot of money to ask the factories to go back. I think some Taiwanese factories have also moved back. Some have, as you said, decoupling has already started. Some factories have moved to Vietnam and other places. If this decoupling continues and the factories move out of China, where will they go to? The Western countries obviously are too expensive. Labor costs are too expensive. Where will they go to?
So there will be some reshoring in the sense that the very high-end, very research development intensive activities may go back to the headquarters countries, Japan, South Korea, the US. But the mid-range value-added activities in the supply chains and the low end, not to mention, are probably going to spill over to other emerging markets, right? So I have already mentioned Vietnam, Mexico, and you just mentioned Taiwan. Taiwan actually benefited a lot during the US-China trade war. Going back to the research that I told you, coming from United Nations, what they find is there's one particular industry, which is office machinery, that didn't seem to go through this trade diversion. What it means is that the US put tariffs on China and basically a substantial decline in exports in that sector, and there's no substitution from other countries. So what it tells you, also based on my research, is China has moved up the value chains in the last 15, 20 years. It is already commanding production of some of the most sophisticated intermediate inputs and parts and components in the world. It's not that easy to replace those high-end, high-skilled production. And you said it exactly right? The cost of labor in China is still lower than advanced economies. Right. And at the same time, even when you look at Vietnam and Mexico, their wages are lower.
What about
productivity may also be lower.
Myanmar, they're low. Their wages are quite low.
Yeah, so all these emerging markets are going to benefit. They're going to take a piece out from what is spinning out from China.
I saw President Trump saying that we can no longer depend on China for the supply chain, and they said that they found this out during this pandemic when they wanted to get medical equipment, and they're having a lot of problems getting it from mainland China. And they say, that's why we need to move these things back outside of China to the US. Is that going to break the supply chain?
So the global supply chains are organized by mostly multinational firms and many small, medium enterprises. So with the exception of few authoritarian regimes, the governments cannot tell the businesses what or what not to do. And of course, they can advise them what to do, but they cannot stop them from going out to invest in other countries. But that said, as you know, you live in Washington, D.C. for a while. In the U.S., they have the so-called CFIUS, Committee of Foreign Investment in the United States. So for a long time, its main role is basically scrutinize investment into the U.S. As a free market, they cannot block foreign U.S. multinational firms to go abroad.
But they block things that feel is a security threat.
Exactly. So I guess in the near future, I'm talking about right now to the next 3-4 years, multinational firms are going to focus more on diversifying away from geopolitical risks. They're going to stress more on minimizing risks or building resilience of supply chains rather than maximizing profits or minimizing costs. As an economist, we like to talk about the second. And now we're going to see the world that's, after the pandemic, focusing more on minimizing risk. And the supply chains are going to be more fragmented in the sense that firms are not going to put all the eggs in one country, whether it's called China or Mexico, doesn't matter. They're going to diversify the supply chains in multiple continents in case something happened in one continent or one region.
They learned that because they put a lot of their eggs in China, and now they're learning that that's bothering them, that's affecting them, right? When these factories move out of mainland China, does it really hurt China a lot? Because right now, what the thinking is that China wants to become an economy where it's consumer dominated, like in the US, Right now, it is not as export dominated, right? Can it become a country where it's consumer dominated, so it's not so reliant on other countries investing in it?
As I said, like the US, China is a big country with a lot of people. So, if you look at the statistics, the dependence on export is actually decreasing from the peak in 2006. If you look at export as a share of GDP from China, it's around 18, 19% right now. Is it going to go back to zero? No, but it probably have.
Can it be a country like the U.S. where the economy is mostly domestic consumption? Can China do that?
It is going into that direction for sure, just because the GDP is increasing and the middle class is expanding in China. It is sort of interesting that, as you said, a few years ago, the Chinese government wanted to put policies to encourage more domestic consumptions and try to be less dependent on trade, and now they are basically forced to do it, right? Because you have the reorganization of supply chains, you have a global recession, implying much lower global demand, at least for 1 year, maybe 2 years. So, when you see fiscal monetary policies, those are probably going to encourage more domestic consumption.
Well, tell me this now. I've just got a couple minutes left. Nobody knows when this coronavirus pandemic is going to end. People say there could be a second wave, a third wave. You just don't know, right? Until there's a vaccine, which is over a year away from now,
right,
nobody can predict what's going to happen, right? Now, how long do you think it'll take for the world? It's not going to go back to the old normal, that's for sure, right? How long do you think it's going to take for the world to come out of the recession, countries begin to boom again, the economy is good again, the stock market rises up again? How long do we have to wait until there's a vaccine and then it starts from zero again, or can that start before there's a vaccine?
So the vaccine is going to be a game changer. Before the vaccine, I think social distancing here in Hong Kong or anywhere in the world will still be practiced. Maybe not at this level right now, but there will be less social interaction. People will be a lot more precautionary when they go out to restaurants or try to have their meetings.
So we're not going to see the economy rebound?
We are not going to see the economy rebound to the normal level until the vaccine comes.
Can that happen when it comes? Can that happen?
It's going to take a while too. I mean, the reason why I would say this is because when you look at the 2008-2009 financial crisis, it took the U.S. almost a decade to go back to the pre-trend, to the pre-crisis trend. Right? What it means is that U.S. has been growing at a certain rate in its economy, in its productivity for a while, but then it slumped during the.
Is it going to take another decade for the world to recover, or for the U.S. to recover?
It's hard to say. I mean, the world is changing every minute right now. But if I have to bet, it's going to take more than a couple of years for the world to go back.
Well, a couple of years is not that bad compared to a decade.
Right.
So you think it's going to be a couple of years?
It's going to be way more than a couple of years, but I don't want to bet my life on a 10 years. I mean, economists, as you know, are very bad at forecasting the economy. So,
well, most economists disagree on forecasting.
They try their best to forecast. You look at all the forecast numbers from investment banks. They vary from negative 1% growth for China to like positive 5% growth. So who are you going to trust?
Right. Okay, we'll have to end it right there. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Good evening.